Thank you. It's been such a treat to be able to exhibit this work in Houston. Um, to elaborate a bit more on the context of which the work came out of was at the time I was living in a small Texas town called Putnam. Putnam is about 30 minutes east of Abilene, Texas. And what brought me out there was my partner. And I started to build this studio after graduating, and basically with this grant money, I put up all this drywall and was looking at it sort of in that space, unfinished, unpainted, not yet mudded, and I decided to make this work to emulate that feeling of being in the studio that's currently under construction. So I had this green rock surrounding me for a long time, and to sort of draw the point of why I use this sheetrock, this material, has a lot to do with the South. It has a lot to do with family. So my stepdad is a contractor, and so this material happened to organically be in my environment. And meanwhile, there's also this big Georgia Pacific factory that is just between Abilene and Lubbock, Texas. So there's a huge part of the community that engages with this material every day, thinking of it in this sort of automatic, this sort of labor involved with the material. And the material has all of these functions that are kind of tied to its identity. So in my work, I try to sort of undo these connotations behind it, right? Like this idea of machismo in the job site and how something can feel engendered despite having such a democratic kind of process of being implemented everywhere. So in my work, I like to think of like it as being queer figurative painting, this really big kind of movement of artists in New York who are really talking about the canon and representation. And I try to bring that to this sort of material specificity. And I owe this kind of to Mark Bradford and Huey Copeland. There's this really wonderful piece called Painting After All. And in that, he talks about how drywall, or not drywall is kind of my riff on it, but in his work, it's paper. It's these tearaway paper signs in southern Los Angeles, and he takes it and he reconstitutes it in the paint. He talks about this kind of connecting to his viewer in a way that they understand, right? We think of a tube of paint and we think of who has access, who has the privileges of using that tube of paint. We think of drywall, we think of house paint, we think of joint compound. They're humble materials, right? Yet I always feel this kind of feeling when I walk in the store and I'm on the job site that I don't belong. So the work comes out of a questioning of that. And for this specific body of work, I was thinking about how to show my relationship to an audience that strongly disapproves of it. I initially showed this installation in the Center for Contemporary Art in Abilene, Texas. And the idea was to have the dogs, which, quick anecdote, my partner had a dog named Missy Lou, and I had a dog named Stella. And whenever we were together, the dogs were together. So I had this archive of images of our dogs playing, of them kind of nuzzling up against each other, of all these like romantic, like tender moments. And it hit me. The dogs are the lesbians and we're the gays and they're our children. It's all really weird and confusing, but that's kind of how our family formed. So throughout this work, you'll notice there's more of an emphasis on the dog as a motif, and the human figure tends to be more subtle. So the figure, I wanted to have this sort of implied presence, like it's in the background, but our focus is on the dogs as subjects to talk about love and relationships, and in particular, intimacy between two. I drew a lot from different like contemporary influences, like the two clocks from Felix Gonzalez Torres, or different writings from queer authors. I think a lot about this connection to literature because it's really important that we kind of build off of something. For me, there's this conversation that happens between John Updike and now a contemporary author, Garth Greenwell, about queer writing, and really in particular, like what queer people have to contribute. John Updike is claiming that because this is tied to our sexuality, it ends there. And therefore, we have nothing unique to contribute other than smut. And Garth Greenwell geniusly takes the smut, implements it into a broader narrative that basically covers a spectrum of experiences. That's kind of what I'm trying to do here. It comes a little bit less across as smut. I am definitely trying to distance a little bit myself from the contemporaries in New York, but I still find it to be really interrelated to this idea of intimacy between two people and the different shapes and forms that can take. I'll open it up to questions. It's yeah. So I've been working in this material for like 7 years now, and really feel kind of like married to it at this point. Who knows if there's a divorce down the road? But for now, it feels like something that continues to reveal itself in these kind of like layers of experimentation. Like in order to get to this mark, I have to start with something that's a subtler carving, like the dogs behind you, right? I I feel that there's something about a relationship with the material that continues to layer and add a certain like uh, part of your experience to that. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but it feels like there's this kind of conversation going on back and forth. And I'm thinking about the complications at home with family, but also like how it carries into like current relationships and that idea of like the old me and the new me, but the material is kind of the same, right? Like the drywall's always kind of been in the background. It's always been this mirror. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the single panel and why none of the other work?
Okay, so none of the other works are framed for like logistical reasons, but this panel was framed and it actually worked really kind of fittingly for the space. Um, it was framed because I entered it in a juried show. And essentially, what I do in my practice is drywall is fairly fugitive. Backed with panel, it has all of the strength and support of lumber or timber, and so it becomes this archival artwork. Um, my artwork isn't always interested in archival practices, but in terms of it having a life outside of the installation that is really kind of temporal, it helps to have that as a means to like make the work have that life in like someone's collection, or just to be able to be kind of protected in that way. um, yeah, there's not a great reason, to be honest, but it does feel like this panel specifically is part of why I wanted to show it at Art League Houston again. And that's because what ended up happening is the relationship kind of comes to a close. And the two panels behind you have this sort of severing of like a ribbon tied between two hands. And this kind of is the opposite, right? It's like the beginning, and they're taking the form of dogs and they're playing together. And so in this piece, when I decided to frame it, I also did this thing in that juried competition where I take drywall mud and I mix tint into it, like pigment, to make it the same color as this. So if you look closely at this, it ties together my current relationship into this older relationship. Like Mitch is carved into this, but it's done so subtly. Like it's that idea of an implied kind of figure. It's just funny I bring that up because even though it was like a juried show, I still wanted to make it relevant and kind of current. And so it's that thing where the submission is just a JPEG of this, but when it shows up, it has this carving you couldn't tell was there in the first place. That's a long story, but yeah. Yeah.
So, when it comes to painting, you tend to think of it as a very additive process. Like that you brought up, like Mark Bradford says That's kind of like one of the first things I thought about when I was looking at this work, even like before seeing the carving and realizing that it's like all etched away. And I was wondering if you could speak to, what the subtractive process means to you, and maybe what are you uncovering from this, and especially working with industrial material.
Yeah.
The point of it is to kind of subtract kind of the natural element of it, whether it be like put up like sheetrock or drywall and then just painting over it whatever color it's meant to be.
Yeah, so it's funny to build off of the last comment was initially I started working on drywall with the idea of paint and how in a sort of paint job you show up and you're expected to just cover up whatever details underneath. I do these like really intricate scenes of him and then in one like fell swoop cover it, right? And it's kind of this like gut wrenching, like, oh, why? And I like to connect that masking to like a masking of the relationship that was also happening in our lives. And I think that idea of a gesture and like what that gesture implies is something I'm considering a lot right now. In particular, removing, mixing into a base, adding again, it feels all very interconnected. Like this move to remove the material is then being re-implemented, thus healing it. Like paint basically has this property that's really lovely and it just seeps into the surface. So when I mix the base with the shavings, it's kind of like healing it. Whereas when I go in for the carving, it's kind of destroying it, damaging it. I think it, for me, relates a lot to intimacy. And like in the personal narrative schema, it's kind of like this idea of like fighting, making up, being closer because you know each other in a different way. But now in a separate sort of like thing for thesis, it all has to do with gesture, right? Like these big knife pulls and all of these different paint applications, you look at it as a viewer and you may see first the motif and then you kind of get to the mark making and think why. Like it's that thing with gestural abstraction that's like so appealing is you can say so much in essentially a few marks. And I was so glad. I was talking to several of y'all last night, recommended the Cy Twombly galleries. I saw it, and it's like delivered so hard. Um, but that thing that you read into it is what's so valuable. And when I'm sharing so much about myself, I want you to be able to also read into it your own narrative or your own story. So recently, the work is kind of a bit more like this. Like these two panels are the newest editions where they have these dogs done from memory, and it has to do with that idea of like taking the material off and remixing it, rehashing it, reapplying it. And so it's like basically I didn't like take material away because it all went back on there. But I like to get people thinking about that, right? Like the two clocks, one is additive, one subtractive. They feel like the two clocks that Felix was thinking about, but all of a sudden you have this difference involved with it. Sweet. Thank y'all.